All right, so let's talk about AWS Direct Connect and the benefits of AWS Direct Connect. So for starters, you've got predictable bandwidth. What I mean by predictable bandwidth is you can request the size of that circuit, of that link, to be of a specific size. You can go all the way up to 10 gigabits per second. So you've got that predictable bandwidth that you can deal with. You also have predictable performance, consistent network experience. And depending on how you use AWS Direct Connect, whether it's through a colo or through your network provider like an AT&T or a Verizon, etc., you're going to have predictable performance. If you're going through a colo, you can expect sub-millisecond connectivity to your AWS virtual private cloud. But regardless, you'll still have predictable performance, as opposed to going over the internet where that performance can fluctuate depending on the traffic at the time of connection. So you've got consistent network experience there. You also have speeds of 1 gigabits per second or 10 gigabits per second. You can also have multiple ports that are kind of bound together, so you can bind multiple ports. So you can have above and beyond 10 gigabits per second if you wanted to. Now, if 1 gigabit per second or 10 gigabit per second seems like a lot, you can also have less than 1 gigabits per second, but then you would have to go through an AWS partner or the AWS partner network, the APN, typically through a colo. So if you're going to bring up AWS on your network using your network service provider, typically you're going to have different varying speeds than you would through co-location. So again, as you get ready and as you're preparing for Direct Connect, depending on the speed that you need and the size of the pipe, make sure that you're evaluating both the co-location and also the network service provider, both on price but also on performance and bandwidth. That way you'll know kind of what you're getting here with both options. With Direct Connect, you also have support for VLAN trunking or 802.1q. So again, that'll be available as part of your network design. And Direct Connect can be partitioned into multiple virtual interfaces. And we'll see that in a diagram that I'm going to bring up here in a second, where you can have AWS connecting, for example, to services that are internet facing and also connecting to services that are completely private on your private network, like the VPC. So we'll dig into all of these diagrams as well. Let's start off with AWS Direct Connect if you were to have it using a network service provider, where it would show up, again, just as a node on your network. The diagram here is pretty simple. Here, you're bringing up AWS just as if you were bringing up just another branch office on your WAN. It was very simple. You go to your network service provider, they will provision a circuit. That circuit, AWS will show up. Depending on how far your corporate data center is from the nearest AWS region or from the nearest AWS edge router, that will determine the speed that you're going to get to AWS. The closer you are to an edge router or to a region, the better performance you're going to get, lower latency you're going, physics is going to take its toll here. So it depends on how far you are. That's what will dictate the amount of performance that you're going to get and also the price. So the price will be affected. This is, again, as simple as it gets, just as if it were another branch office on your WAN. Now, when you get into co-location, you have more options as far as speed is concerned, and it opens up a lot of different scenarios for you. Now, what you have here is you have a co-location, something like an Equinix, a Switch, a CoreSite. There's many of them. And what you do is, in a lot of cases, AWS will have a presence within this co-location. And what I mean by presence is it's so close, it's within a fiber cross connect. So you've got predictable performance, you've got predictable bandwidth, predictable proximity to AWS. So sub-millisecond is very possible here. Now, what you get with this as well is now you still have to connect your corporate data center to the colo. So not only are you putting equipment in the colo in order to connect from your corporate data center into that colo, but then you're establishing the connection to AWS. So keep that in mind. Yes, you'll probably get maybe a cost benefit here. From a connection perspective, from the colo to AWS, you're going to get greater network connectivity. So you'll get 10 gigabits per second. You'll be able to get binded 10 gigabit circuits here. So you'll be able to get many 10 gigabits per second connectivity to AWS. And it'll also open up a lot of different use cases for you. So now you've got the colo where you can move certain types of hardware into it to bring it closer to the cloud. So again, if you wanted to improve the performance of a particular application where maybe you're separating the different components of that application, you want to keep the database or the storage under your control completely, maybe you bring that from the data center into the colo, and because the colo has such close proximity to AWS, now you've improved the performance. You can put the compute in AWS, keep the other components of that application in the colo, and again, because it's a fiber cross connect, because it's so close, because the latency is so low, it enables and opens up a lot of different use cases. So that's one where, again, that private connectivity, it's usually an MPLS that's connecting your corporate data center to the colo, and then from the colo, it's very easy to get access to AWS. Now, another method would be to go over the internet and connect to that colo. So again, depending on the use case, depending on the application, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, if you don't need a large pipe, if you don't need a very strong connection between your data center and the colo, maybe an internet VPN connection between your corporate data center and the colocation is sufficient. In the event where no, you want to expand the use cases and you've got complicated application architectures, at that point you will want to have more of a dedicated private connection between your data center and the colo. Remember, by default, Direct Connect does not come with, it's not redundant. Now, AWS best practice will dictate that you have redundancy with AWS, which means you're going to need 2 ports on 2 separate routers on the AWS side, and you'll have to do the same thing on your corporate data center side as well to have complete redundancy all the way through between your corporate data center and AWS. So remember that for the exam, but also, if you're not taking the exam, just for your own knowledge, by default, when you're going to price this thing, redundancy is not factored in. So make sure you factor that in if it's important to you. All right, I mentioned virtual interfaces. So Direct Connect can be partitioned into multiple virtual interfaces, otherwise known as a VIF. So what I mean by that is you can have a virtual interface that is public connectivity to things like S3, EC2, DynamoDB, and then you can have private connectivity to your VPC. Now what that looks like from a diagram perspective is something like this. So this would typically be your environment. You've got your customer, the customer router on the left here. You've got Direct Connect, the location or however way you're connecting, and then you've got the Direct Connect router that you're connecting to. You can see that we've got 2 VLANs. We've got VLAN 1 and VLAN 2. VLAN 1 is going to be our internet facing stuff, and VLAN 2 is going to be our private connectivity to our VPC. What you can do then is, again, partition that Direct Connect link so that you're connecting VLAN 1, which is everything that you want that's internet facing, that's going over a public VIF to things like Amazon S3, to any instances that maybe have a public IP address or an EIP address, to things like DynamoDB. And then you have a private connectivity to your virtual private cloud. This is all the traffic that does not need to hit any kind of internet facing services. So again, this is what it would look like. And the key takeaway here is that Direct Connect can be partitioned so that you have several different VIFs available to you. Now, I wanted to also make sure that I provide you with additional information, additional reading material, additional viewing material that you can use if you're taking the exam and want more in-depth information on Direct Connect, or if you're simply a cloud architect that's looking to, again, architect highly available, very advanced Direct Connect connectivities and VPN connectivities. There's a YouTube that I highly recommend, which gives a deep dive on AWS Direct Connect. And then there's also the AWS Direct Connect page on Amazon that I would recommend that you go to as your central point for all of the documentation around this particular technology.